Jazz and coffee is one of the undefeated duos of all time. I mean, I'm talking, it's up there with the likes of Peanut Butter and Jelly, Batman and Robin, and Drinking and Driving. In the US, jazz numbers and sales have continued to drop dramatically year after year, just like my GPA. And fewer sales lead to fewer listeners, and that's been very apparent over the past few years. Nowadays, the only jazz musicians that people can name are whose artistic careers ended years ago. People like Miles Davis, Chick Corea, Theodotus Monk. And nowadays, the only jazz artist most people can probably think of is Laufey. Recently, within the last few years, Spotify and Apple Music have hired freelance artists under the guise of other bands to create jazz music for their platform, in turn actually hindering the growth of a lot of new jazz musicians and hiding the old classics underneath. In turn, degrading the quality of the expansive library of jazz music. And the thing is, jazz influences continue to be seen in our modern music landscape. I mean, it's influenced the likes of R&B, soul music, country music. Anything you can really think of kind of can draw its derivatives and roots back to jazz. However, what this has done is just relegate jazz music to be some sort of background or secondary music that you might hear in a cafe or a bookstore, and not as its own genre anymore. I think this is because music has taken on a more lyrical and vocal aspect. Not to say that jazz doesn't utilize this at some points, but unlike artists speaking for themselves in jazz, the instruments do the talking.
Okay, $19 Fortnite card. Who wants it? And yes, I'm giving it away.
However, they cannot seem to speak to the sales god. Whether that be how it's easier now to hum the melody of a pop song rather than a jazz fusion song, or maybe it's due to the fact that it's easier for a brand to sell a band's personality rather than their own personal musical talents. And all of these factors have culminated into the US no longer being the leading listener base of jazz music. That title now being delegated to Japan. Interestingly enough, a place where jazz music had been sanctioned to the shadow world twice before. This is why jazz will never die. Now, before I get into the reasonings and how jazz made its way over to Japan, I think it is very important to lay out the foundation of which jazz was built upon and to identify the people that helped create jazz as we know it is today. The beginnings of jazz actually date back to around the 19th century, where it's rooted in New Orleans and is home to Congo Square, which was a place where, at the time, slaves would gather and play music. This tradition started in 1820. Now, over time, the blending of African and Caribbean music was joined by marching band instruments. This was heavily due to the prevalence of marching band instruments being used during the Civil War. Now, with the introduction of these brass instruments to a lot of the Southerners at the time, this eventually formed the genre which is now known as ragtime. Now, ragtime was being one of the biggest proponents of what would eventually lead to the formulation of jazz music, which would become a little bit more prevalent when the genre of blues spread towards Louisiana. In time, all of these different sounds and different genres of music melded together into what is known as jazz. I also think it's important to mention the genres that helped spearhead jazz into being one of the most prominent genres from in the 20th century. Buddy Bolden is often considered as the first person who spearheaded and crafted the mold for what would be jazz music, as he was the first prominent figure within the jazz atmosphere. However, it's also important to mention that there were many other African-American jazz artists at the time, such as Bunk Johnson and Joe Oliver. I also think it's important to mention some of the Creole musicians of the time, such as Jelly Roll Morton and Freddie Capard. So now that brings it on how jazz got to Japan. And sadly, the start of the spread of jazz to Japan did not have a great start. First, we must make our way to the Philippines. From 1565 to 1898, the Philippines had been occupied by Spain. 1898 marked the year of the signing of the Treaty of Paris, giving the United States sovereignty over the Philippines. The people of the Philippines were obviously not appeased by this. They were simply trading one colonial ruler for another, and they revolted 2 days before the treaty was signed. This led to a 3-year conflict called the Philippine-American War, of battles, famine, and sadly, lots of death. Around 20,000 Filipino soldiers and 200,000 Filipino civilians suffered death during these 3 years. This was due to American forces burning villages, cholera and malaria epidemics, and agricultural failures. And in the year 1902, the fighting had been ordered to stop by President William Howard Taft. This ushered in 4 decades of American forces occupying the country. And this occupation led to the mingling of American and Filipino cultures and led to many Filipinos being introduced to the genre of jazz.
Around 1920 was when jazz kind of arrived in Japan. Jazz music was kind of introduced to the Japanese public through Filipino artists and some occasional American artists. And as jazz music started to become more popular, people in Japan started to adopt this style. And there's no real band that is attributed to being the first band to kind of contribute to the jazz scene in Japan, but people like to point fingers at the Hiteno Jazz Band as being the first primary jazz band to exist in Japan. However, many jazz historians would probably tell you that the jazz music being played in Japan around the 1920s and 1930s would be considered more dancehall music instead of jazz.
Local jazz performances began to take place in 2 notable cities in Japan, those being Osaka and Kobe. Jazz music was often played in dance halls, and by 1924, Osaka had 20 dance halls alone. However, with all this booming popularity in the genre of jazz, the first attempted murder happened, and it was led by the conservatives. And the Japanese elite were tired of hearing those nasty chords they were cooking up in the dance halls, so they banned the playing of jazz music in Osaka. Like, just imagine, you're hearing the most devious, just organic piano solo you've heard in your life, and the music police pull up on you?
Put those jazz hands up right now.
Well, we are at the oldest jazz cafe in Chigusa, Japan, also called Jazukisa. These jazz cafes became the alternative for the dance halls of the 1920s. Instead of kicking your feet around, you could sit back and kick your feet up, all while enjoying a cup of joe and listening to a sexy saxophone be played in your ears. Now, these jazz cafes became really popular around the 1940s, with about 80 of them being built before the start of World War II, which was when the second attempted assassination of jazz would happen in Japan. Thinking of World War II, the Japanese government ordered the burning of the American jazz records, as it was considered enemy music. Now, many of these Japanese citizens didn't follow these orders and hid their records until the end of the war. But many records were still burned due to this order enacted by the Japanese government. Jazz was being burned at the stake like it was the medieval times again. And in addition to all of this, during the war, many of the jazz cafes at the time were destroyed during air raids. However, through all of this, jazz survived the war. Japan had suffered many casualties and damage after the war, whether this be their infrastructure or their culture or their people. And after the war, American occupation took place throughout Japan. Many Americans, and Japanese people as well, wanting to hear the music from America, turned to listening to jazz, which was being played in Japan. This led to a rebirth of jazz music in Japan, and brought it back into the mainstream, where it continued its legacy for years and years and years, catapulting many Japanese jazz musicians to the main stage of the jazz world throughout the 50s and beyond. Well, that must be it. Jazz was never killed, and it never will be. Right? As I mentioned before, jazz has become secondary music. It's become something people don't inherently think of, I feel like, as its own genre. It is something that it goes together with something else, but cannot be in its own entirety. And this has caused the jazz fire to slowly be depleted, to have its ashes spread everywhere and its flames grow weak, yearning and hungering for sustenance. I think lately, people as prominent as Laufey have brought a sudden burst of flames and of fulfillment to the jazz genre. It's giving it more mainstream attention and giving it some sort of light and flame that it hasn't seen in decades at this point. However, for a fire to keep on going, there needs to be more than one log. There needs to be kindling, there needs to be sparks, there needs to be advancements. And I think that jazz is moving in that direction. There are so many artists now who are taking the genres that we have seen before and are molding it and crafting it into new ways, into new listening experiences for me, you, and everyone else. Some of the people I think that are kindling this fire quite well right now are people like Urza Collective, Nubia Garcia, Donna and Alden, Barilos, Cortex, Cro-Magnon, Macabre Plaza. All of these people are contributing to the field in different ways that aren't inherently similar to one another, but all happen to be wrapped up in this genre called jazz. I think if all these artists I just mentioned, and Laufey and other artists that I do not know, and some that I just, I can't name every single artist I listen to or know of, but if these artists continue to stoke the flames and to pursue what they're passionate about and to make jazz come to the forefront that it once was, I don't think this fire will ever be squashed out. It's been attempted to be muffled out. It's been attempted to be burned out. It's been attempted to be everything in between. It's starting from where the roots, from where it came to where it is today. It has had a tumultuous, difficult journey. Unlike many other genres, I'd say. There aren't many genres, I'd say, that have continued to exist so prevalently in the world, that people so still enjoy to this day, even as it slowly fades away. While the flame of jazz may not be as bright as it used to be, it is patiently waiting for its turn to spread again and to make its mark on the world. Finally awake, eh? Do you even know all the trouble you caused me last night? I mean, I said you could have a drink or two, but god fucking damn. You had way too much. And usually, the shit that you did, I'd charge people out the ass. But I'm gonna cut you a special deal. Let's say if you just like, comment, and subscribe on this video, I'll forget all about your little mishaps last night. Does that sound good? I thought it did. Now get the fuck out.